Alexander Reed, a millionaire used to having everything under control, humiliated his maid in front of dozens of guests, believing she was nothing more than just another. But that very night, his 6-year-old daughter wandered too close to the garden pool, and in seconds, the glamorous party turned into a nightmare. What happens next is unbelievable. The mansion of Alexander Reed shone like a crystal beacon on the hill that night. Guests moved among chandeliers and orchid arrangements, glasses clinking with promises of business. At 42, Alexander wore a flawless smile and the posture of a man who commanded the tide. Inside, however, tension bit at his shoulders, measuring every glance and every handshake. The string music painted a soft luxury that had sharpened conversations. Discreet security guards guided the flow like invisible conductors of a social symphony. The torchlit garden reflected on the pool water like a second sky. Silver trays carried canapes that melted before they begged for praise. Alexander moved among investors like the central piece of a perfect chessboard. The walls displayed modern art he called investment, never affection. Somewhere within all that beauty, the air felt thin, and he couldn't tell why. At the edge of the ballroom, real life watched unseen, ready to intervene. Grace Miller, 30, slipped through corridors with the skill of one who dissolves problems. Her plain uniform could not erase the contained elegance of her precise gestures. In her pockets she carried pins, tape, and a silent repertoire of solutions. Her eyes held the gleam of someone who had endured days harsher than a millionaire's party. She swallowed cutting remarks like someone who had learned to survive without losing dignity. Her thoughts turned to her sick mother and the bills waiting once the lights went out. Still, there was kindness in every napkin fold her hands shaped. She noticed details no one else saw. The drip of glasses, the pace of anxious steps. The ballroom reflected Alexander. The staff reflected Grace, a structure that never collapsed. Crossing the lobby, she felt eyes on her. Some cold, some hollow. She drew a deep breath and continued, knowing the world rarely applauds the invisible. But something in the air promised that, tonight, the invisible would find a voice. Sophia Reed, 6 years old, wandered between tall chairs as though charting constellations. A light blue dress, a ribbon in her hair, and a charm that asked no permission. The loud sounds of the ballroom sometimes stung inside her, and she sought havens of light. The pool in the garden seemed a calm mirror whispering softly to her. She followed the lights along its edges as if drawing secret maps in her mind. Alexander watched from afar, torn between handshakes and unspoken worries. He wanted everything to flow perfectly, including his daughter, without noise, without mishap. Grace noticed Sophia's quiet rhythm and discreetly wheeled over a juice cart. The little girl offered a brief smile, as if recognizing a safe harbor in a stormy sea. From the ballroom, metallic laughter rose, born of the carelessness power allows. Alexander's eyes caught on a detail, a flower out of place, that stabbed at his perfectionism. And in that instant, as brief as a snap, the night began to shift its tone. While speaking with investors, Alexander Reed spotted a flower arrangement slightly askew. He called over a waiter, who, nervous, couldn't respond. His gaze then fell on Grace Miller, adjusting a tray nearby. He strode toward her, firm steps cutting through the room. "Can't you even keep this in order?" he barked, his voice sharp as steel. Guests fell silent for a few seconds, the tension thick in the air. Grace, long used to words that struck like weights, straightened calmly. "I was already taking care of it, Mr. Reed," she replied, steady yet respectful. Alexander's laugh echoed coldly through the room, turning dignity into spectacle. Taking care of it? This late, A house like mine cannot look like a cheap warehouse. Faces turned, some embarrassed, others hungry for scandal. And the night, which had gleamed so far, revealed its first crack beneath the gold. Grace felt heat rush to her face but kept her eyes lowered. Each word struck like a stone, but she refused to let them break her. She thought of her ill mother, of her income, of the bills piling at home. She swallowed hard, refusing to give tears as tribute. The silence among the staff was one of mute complicity, all too accustomed to such scenes. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances, though none stepped forward. For Alexander, it was just another display of authority before an audience. For Grace, it was another proof that the world stored ironies no fortune could erase. Sophia, seated near the piano, watched without grasping the full weight of the moment. Her eyes traveled from her father's face to Grace's. In her, there was a silent sensitivity, as if she could sense invisible pains. And that innocent perception planted a seed that would bloom sooner than anyone expected. Alexander turned back, satisfied, resuming his talk with investors. He believed he had restored order and discipline to the night. Grace stood still for a moment, breathing deeply until her strength returned. Her chest burned with hurt, yet her eyes held dignity intact. The ballroom laughed again, glasses clinked, and the incident seemed forgotten. But not all forgot. Some whispered, quietly disapproving. From a distance, Sophia still looked at Grace, as though searching for an answer in her. Grace's plain uniform contrasted with the glittering gowns surrounding her. Yet it was in that figure that the girl felt safety and tenderness. The night carried on, but fate had already marked that scene as a prelude. The lights still sparkled, concealing the invisible thread that would soon bind them all. And the garden pool, calm and silent, waited as the stage for an unexpected turn. The party went on with string music, clinking glasses, and sharp-tongued chatter. Outside, in the torchlit garden, the night breathed differently. Fresh air carried the scent of watered flowers, mingling with the pool's blue reflection. Sophia Reed, 6 years old, observed it all with innocent curiosity. Her small feet carried her onto the lawn while her father dealt inside. Her eyes glowed at the lanterns mirrored in the still water. To her, the garden was a secret kingdom, separate from adult noise. Her blue dress swayed in the breeze, the ribbon in her hair fluttering like a banner. Her stuffed bunny, inseparable companion, joined her exploration. With each step, she felt farther from the party's weight and closer to a world of her own. But no one noticed that this enchanted setting hid silent risks, and that every innocent movement was a thread being pulled toward the inevitable. Inside the mansion, Alexander Reed raised glasses and collected business promises. Laughter returned to his face, masking the sting of his clash with Grace Miller. He believed he controlled every detail, from the buffet to the alliances. But he didn't notice that his daughter was no longer within sight. The nanny, given the night off, was absent to watch her. Sophia walked deeper into the garden, chasing the shimmer of the water. Torchlight reflected on the pool, calling to her like stars on the ground. From inside, Grace glimpsed the girl straying beyond the glass doors. A tightness gripped her chest, warning that something was amiss. Her instincts screamed of hidden danger in the calm. Yet with a tray in her hands and orders in her mind, she hesitated for seconds. And in that pause, the distance between innocence and tragedy shrank. Sophia knelt by the edge, her knees pressing into damp grass. Her stuffed bunny nearly slipped into the water, and she leaned to retrieve it. The rippling reflection painted shapes that held her transfixed. A stronger breeze pushed her slightly forward. The pool's surface beckoned as if it were a glass floor to play upon. She reached out, trying to touch the liquid mirror. Inside, the party roared on, distant as another world. Grace, from the doorway, noticed the child alone in the dark. Her heart raced, sensing the danger instantly. She set the tray on the nearest table and hurried forward. The instinct that had faltered before now thundered louder than reason. Each step felt like a race against time slipping too fast. Sophia leaned further, reaching for the bunny sliding toward the water. Her fingers brushed it, but her body lost balance. In an instant, the blue dress flared like a sail in the wind, and she tumbled into the pool. The cold water engulfed her brutally, stealing her breath. Her wide eyes searched upward, but the weight of the dress dragged her down. Bubbles rose quickly, betraying her desperate struggle. She thrashed, reaching for the slick edge with no success. Torchlight shimmered above her, stars trembling out of reach. The stuffed bunny floated beside her, silent witness to the fight. Inside, the music drowned out her muffled cries. The adult world kept celebrating, blind to the drama just steps away. And every second stretched longer, harsher for Sophia. Grace Miller sprinted across the garden, her heart hammering against her chest. Her eyes caught the blue dress floating in the water, tangled with desperate movements. Shock froze her body, but hesitation lasted less than a breath. Without thinking, she dove in, uniform and all, breaking the pool's surface. The cold water burned her skin, but she swam hard toward the child. Her arms reached Sophia at the shallow bottom, pulling her against her own body. The little girl was pale, eyes wide with panic. Grace kicked upward, breaking the surface with force. Air stabbed into her lungs, but she didn't stop. She held Sophia tightly, keeping the girl's head above water. The ripples mirrored their silent struggle, and every stroke was powered by the urgency of not letting life slip away. Guests heard the splash and rushed to the veranda. Shouts echoed when they saw Grace dragging Sophia to the edge. Inside, Alexander Reed turned, his heart leaping into his throat. He dropped his glass to the floor and bolted through the glass corridor to the garden. The scene burned into his mind. The maid fighting the water with his daughter in her arms. He fell to his knees, stretching his hands to pull Sophia out. Grace handed her over, gasping, her hair plastered to her face. Sophia coughed violently, choking up swallowed water, crying in fear. The millionaire hugged her tight, tears spilling uninvited down his face. He looked at Grace, wordless, the truth heavy in his chest. The very woman he had humiliated minutes before had just saved his daughter. And that reality struck harder than any blow he had ever endured. Alexander Reed held Sophia in his arms, feeling her small body tremble against him. With every cough, she regained breath, but the sound sliced through his soul like a blade. Guests crowded around, some offering towels, others only staring in shock. The millionaire, always master of his image, now knelt drenched and desperate. Tears streamed freely, exposing the fragility he always hid. He looked at Grace Miller, soaked, her uniform clinging, struggling to catch her breath. His chest burned at the memory of the cruel words he had thrown at her earlier. The contrast was unbearable. The woman he mocked was the one who saved his child. Silence spread through the garden, broken only by Sophia's sobs. Alexander tried to speak, but his voice failed, strangled by the weight of regret. His hands shook as he caressed his daughter's wet face, and deep inside, he knew he would never forget this moment. Grace, still breathless, slowly rose, her legs unsteady beneath her. She accepted a towel from someone, but her eyes remained fixed on Sophia. The child, still sobbing, stretched her hand toward her. The innocent gesture shattered Alexander's heart. as if his daughter already knew to whom she owed her life. Grace touched the tiny hand gently, forcing a faint smile despite her exhaustion. Sophia's silent gratitude was worth more than any words the adults could say. Guests began to murmur, whispering about the maid's courage. Some glances turned toward Alexander, waiting for his reaction. He, however, stood frozen, chained by pride. Only his eyes betrayed the war between arrogance and redemption. Grace stepped back slowly, giving space to the father, but Sophia clung to her hand. And that simple bond transformed the silence into a living accusation against Alexander. The mansion's manager approached, worried by the chaos still unfolding. He offered to call a doctor, but Alexander refused, claiming it was under control. His voice, however, carried no firmness, only fear. Grace, still trembling, softly suggested taking Sophia to rest. He hesitated, as if accepting advice meant admitting weakness. But the fragility of his daughter outweighed his pride, and he nodded. They entered the mansion together, trailed by eyes that whispered silently. Sophia, exhausted, leaned on her father's shoulder but still reached for Grace's hand. The maid walked beside them, discreet yet undeniable. Every step burned Alexander's pride like an open wound. He knew he couldn't pretend nothing had happened, and deep down, he began to understand that his life had just changed forever. Sophia's room was prepared in haste, fresh sheets and a lamp casting soft light. Alexander laid her down carefully, covering her with her favorite blanket. The girl still trembled, but her breathing steadied. Her stuffed bunny, rescued from the garden, was placed beside her for comfort. Grace Miller stood quietly a few steps from the bed. Her body still dripped pool water, but her eyes were fixed on the child. Sophia reached out her hand, and Grace held it for a moment. Alexander watched, torn, too unsure to interrupt. The silence in the room spoke louder than words. It was the kind of silence that revealed truths buried under pride. Every breath from Sophia hammered into the millionaire's chest, and with it came the relentless reminder that he had failed as a father. Grace gently released Sophia's hand and smoothed the girl's hair. The simple gesture radiated tenderness, though wrapped in professionalism. Alexander turned away, unsettled by his own vulnerability. He wasn't used to feeling powerless before anyone, and yet he knew he never could have acted as she did. The image of Grace diving into the pool replayed like a film in his mind. Shame burned through him for humiliating her earlier that night. Regret seared like hot iron, but the words would not come. His pride kept him silent, though the debt was undeniable. He looked at Grace as if searching for something, only to find an uncomfortable mirror. Her courage exposed his cowardice, and it was unbearable. Each second of silence deepened the wound. Outside, the party continued, muffled by the walls of the room. Alexander heard laughter and chatter as if from another world. The contrast between the ballroom's euphoria and the recent drama tore him apart. He looked at his daughter, slowly drifting into sleep, still clutching her bunny. In her, he saw the innocence nearly lost to neglect and arrogance, and he felt the weight of gratitude he still couldn't voice. Grace adjusted the towel around her shoulders, ready to leave quietly. Before stepping out, she cast one last tender look at Sophia. Alexander noticed but could manage only a restrained nod. Inside, he longed to thank her, but the words seemed too small. Grace left the room, leaving behind the certainty that something had changed forever. And Alexander remained still, the silence itself his rightful punishment. The night deepened, but inside the mansion Alexander Reed's heart still raced. He paced alone in the library, an untouched glass of whiskey in hand. Shelves of books loomed over him, their spines like mute judgments. The image of Grace diving into the pool replayed endlessly. It was a cruel reminder of his own impotence. He also remembered the cold laugh he had unleashed when humiliating her. Now, that same woman stood in his mind as a heroine. It was a reversal his proud mind could not process. He wondered whether guests would gossip more about the party or the incident. Deep down, he feared the event would stain his reputation. But more painful than public opinion was the awareness of his failure as a father. And that invisible wound hurt more than any business defeat ever could. In her modest room at the back of the mansion, Grace Miller couldn't sleep. Her wet clothes hung to dry, but the memory stayed vivid. The scent of chlorine clung to her hair, mingled with the chill of fear. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Sophia thrashing in the water. Her chest tightened, though relief came with the thought. The girl was alive, and that was enough. Still, Alexander's harsh words echoed in her memory. The humiliation before so many would not fade easily. She wondered if he would ever have the humility to acknowledge what had happened. She sought no recognition, only silent justice in the form of respect. In the solitude of her room, tears finally escaped, the ones she had swallowed in the ballroom. They carried the weight of a life of imposed silences, dignity upheld by force. Yet they also bore the strength of someone who survives on the margins of another's pride. While the city slept, Sophia stirred in her dreams. In the middle of her sleep, she called for Grace, soft, yet clear. Alexander, keeping watch from the doorway, heard the whisper and froze. His heart tightened as he realized his daughter sought comfort in the maid, not in him. He felt defeated, as if his authority had been stolen by another's tenderness. And yet, at the same time, he couldn't deny he was grateful for it. The truth was simple. Grace had given his daughter what he did not know how to offer, and that realization stripped him of every mask, leaving him bare before the truth. He returned to the library, unable to sleep, haunted by his own reflection in the glass. The untouched glass of whiskey exposed his inability to numb himself. Dawn felt endless, weighted with questions that had no answers. And deep down, he knew morning would bring even harder truths to face. The sun rose shyly over the mansion, tinting the stained glass with gentle gold. Alexander Reed came down to breakfast with slow steps, still drained by the night. The staff avoided his eyes, whispering about what had happened. He felt each glance like a mirror, reflecting his failure before them all. The table was set with fruit and bread, but he had no appetite. He sat in silence, staring at the emptiness reflected in the crystal. Sophia appeared in pajamas, clutching her stuffed bunny, smiling sweetly. She sat beside him, then quickly asked, "Where's Grace?" The question sliced through the wall of his pride like a blade. Alexander looked away, sipping coffee he didn't want. He knew he could no longer ignore that woman's presence in their lives, and shame consumed him for having been cruel to her in front of so many. Grace Miller entered quietly, still in her simple uniform. She carried a tray with tea and fruit for Sophia, as if nothing had happened. Her tired eyes held professional steadiness, refusing any display of heroics. Sophia ran to her, hugging her with spontaneous joy. The gesture drew murmurs from the other staff, surprised by the evident affection. Grace smiled, stroked the girl's hair, and set the tray on the table. Alexander watched in silence, his hands locked in his lap. He wanted to thank her, but pride turned the word to stone in his throat. Instead, he merely nodded, far too timid a gesture for what he felt. Grace didn't reply. She simply continued her work with the same serene composure. But beneath it all, every gesture weighed on his conscience like a silent judgment. And Alexander knew he couldn't keep running from that truth. Later, the investors began to arrive as planned. Alexander, always master of appearances, put on his suit and straightened his tie. But the mirror did not return the same man as yesterday. He saw tired eyes, cracked with shame, unable to hide. He entered the meeting room, but his mind wouldn't leave the garden. The image of Grace emerging from the pool with Sophia in her arms burned inside him. Conversations about numbers and projections rang hollow, lifeless noise. Each time he signed a document, his authority felt like a loose mask. Outside, Sophia's laughter as she played with Grace drifted through the walls. He closed his eyes, trying to focus, but could think only of her. He knew that at some point he would have to stand and face them all with the truth. And that moment was closer than he dared admit. The meeting went on, but Alexander Reed was absent in thought. While investors showed charts and projections, he heard only Sophia's distant laughter. Each laugh echoed through the walls like music and sentence. It revealed something simple. His daughter was happy, but not because of him. Alexander's eyes dropped to the papers, the lines blurring. He could not shake the image of Grace Miller diving into the water. That scene replayed like a tattoo in his memory, impossible to erase. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated, stumbling over his own voice. Executives exchanged glances, surprised by the millionaire's lack of firmness. He took a breath and said only what was necessary, without his usual arrogance. It was the first visible crack in the facade of the unshakable man. And behind it, something he couldn't yet name began to grow. When the meeting ended, Alexander didn't return straight to his office. Instead, he followed the sound of laughter to the mansion's garden. There he found Sophia seated on the grass, surrounded by crayons and paper. Grace sat beside her, helping her draw the pool's reflection in soft colors. The girl looked up at her father with excitement, showing him the unfinished drawing. "Look, Daddy, it's the pool, and it's Grace saving me." Alexander's heart clenched, crushed by the simplicity of the truth. Grace lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the mention, while Sophia beamed. He approached slowly, feeling his breath grow heavy. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, though his voice broke at the end. Sophia ran to hug him, then returned to Grace's lap. And in that innocent gesture, Alexander saw the depth of the bond taking root. He stayed there, silent, watching the two of them. Grace guided Sophia's hand with patience, helping her hold the crayon. The contrast between the tenderness of the scene and the coldness he had cultivated hurt. He felt ashamed for not being that kind of presence in his daughter's life. His eyes watered, and he blinked fast to hide it. Grace looked up for a moment and met his gaze. There was no reproach in her eyes, only a steady serenity. In that instant, Alexander understood. It wasn't only gratitude, it was learning. Something in him was changing, even as he resisted. Pride shouted to keep the walls up, but his heart was already seeking a way out. Sophia, oblivious to adult weight, laughed as she colored a yellow sun in the page's corner. And the millionaire realized the greatest investment of his life might be right before him. In the late afternoon, Alexander Reed was called by the mansion's manager. In the office, a screen displayed the security camera footage. He watched in silence the moment Sophia approached the pool. The blue dress swaying in the wind, the bunny nearly falling, the fatal imbalance. His stomach churned as he saw her sink without anyone there to react. Then Grace Miller appeared on screen, diving without hesitation. The heavy uniform, loose hair, her body thrown fully into saving the girl. The camera captured every second of the struggle, each desperate stroke, until she surfaced with Sophia in her arms, coughing and crying with relief. Alexander covered his face, unable to watch to the end. The manager murmured something about tightening security, but he barely heard. All he could see was the image of his own failure. He left the office stunned, his steps echoing through the corridors. The The mansion felt larger and colder than ever. Every painting on the wall seemed to watch him, demanding explanations. He went down to the hall and found Sophia playing safely, with Grace nearby. The girl's gentle laughter carried the memory of what might have been. Alexander leaned against the wall, his heart heavy as stone. He realized that if Grace hadn't acted, he would now be burying his daughter. The thought made him shudder, cold sweat running down his neck. He felt ashamed for needing someone else to fulfill a father's role. But more than that, he felt indebted to a woman he had scorned. The humiliation he had thrown at her now weighed like an unbearable burden, and the silence between them could not last much longer. That night, he gathered the courage to face what he'd been avoiding. He entered the ballroom, where part of the staff prepared the event's final details. Guests still moved about, fewer now, carried by soft conversation. Alexander stopped in the center, asking for silence with a firm gesture. All eyes turned to him, curious and attentive. The millionaire drew a deep breath, pride resisting like a chain. But the image of Sophia in the water forced him to break his own bonds. "I want to offer a public thanks," he began, his voice carrying through the room. He looked directly at Grace, who froze beneath his gaze. "Last night I was unjust. I humiliated this woman without cause. And a few hours later, she saved my daughter's life." The entire room fell into silence, waiting for what would come next. The silence that fell over the hall felt heavier than the mansion's marble walls. Every gaze was fixed on Alexander Reed, waiting for his next words. He drew a deep breath, his heart beating faster than usual. The image of Sophia thrashing in the water still burned in his mind. "Grace Miller, before everyone here, I want to apologize. Last night, I disrespected you in a cruel and unjust way, but it was you who risked your own life to save my daughter." The words came out firm, yet loaded with emotion he could no longer conceal. Some guests lowered their eyes, ashamed to have witnessed his earlier arrogance. Others whispered among themselves, struck by the public confession. Grace stood still, her heart racing, surprised to hear those words, and the weight of the humiliation she had endured was finally beginning to mend. Sophia, seated near the piano, smiled at the mention of Grace's name. She stood up and ran toward her, embracing her with the innocence of a child. The gesture drew discreet tears from a few staff members watching. Grace knelt to hold the girl, feeling the purity of that embrace. She looked at Alexander, who met her gaze with tear-filled eyes. There was no arrogance left, only a man stripped of his defenses. "Thank you for recognizing it," Grace said, her voice calm and steady. She sought no applause, only respect. The guests began a timid applause, which soon spread through the hall. The sound echoed like a collective catharsis, a silent acknowledgement of justice. Alexander remained still, letting himself be carried by the moment. It felt as if each clap freed him a little more from the weight he carried. When the applause faded, the strings returned to fill the air. Alexander walked to his daughter and lifted her into his arms. He looked at Grace, hesitating for a moment before saying, "I owe you more than I can ever express. If you ever need me, I will be there." Grace nodded without vanity, only with dignity. Sophia smiled, hiding her face in her father's shoulder but keeping her hand extended toward the maid. Alexander held his daughter close, feeling the sweetness of the gesture. Deep inside, he knew this moment would change his reputation, but more than that, his soul. For the first time, he did not care about the investors' whispers or tomorrow's headlines. What mattered was that his daughter was alive, and that he had learned something priceless about humility. The hall resumed its rhythm, but nothing would ever be the same again. And Alexander knew this was only the beginning of his transformation. The next morning, the sun lit the mansion's gardens as if nothing had happened. But inside Alexander Reed, everything was different. He walked the wide corridors with slow steps, as though carrying lead in his feet. At every corner, he saw reflections of the night before. The guests' laughter, Sophia's fall, Grace's dive. The staff greeted him quietly, more respectful than ever. Not out of fear, but out of the memory of what they had witnessed. Alexander no longer saw servants. He saw witnesses to his greatest failure and his greatest lesson. In the main hall, the flower arrangements still stood intact, perfuming the air. He stopped before them and smiled bitterly. Yesterday, a tiny detail like that had been reason enough to humiliate Grace. Today, he remembered it as proof of his own smallness. And he understood that arrogance had never been the same as greatness. Grace Miller was already at work, collecting glasses and tidying the space. Her uniform, damp from the morning dew, marked her quiet routine. Alexander watched her from afar, not yet brave enough to approach. In each of her movements, he noticed a quiet strength, a dignity that asked for nothing. Sophia came running, laughing, and clung naturally to Grace's legs. Alexander's heart tightened, but it also warmed at the sight. The little girl seemed to recognize in this woman something he could not provide. Grace knelt, brushing her hair back with almost motherly tenderness. Alexander stepped closer, and Sophia, smiling, ran into his arms. But even there, in her father's embrace, she still pointed toward Grace. The millionaire swallowed hard, recognizing that he could not erase this bond. Life had already woven its ties, and he had no choice but to honor them. Later that day, during another meeting with investors, Alexander made an unexpected choice. He abandoned the cold script of presentations and spoke of people, not numbers. He told them about the night before, about his mistake, about the courage that saved his daughter. He said that wealth was not only in figures, but in the humanity with which we live. The executives listened in silence, some admiring, others shocked. It was rare to see a man of his stature expose vulnerability among peers. But Alexander felt no shame. For the first time, his words came from the heart, not from ambition. He knew Grace had shown him a mirror he could not ignore, and that Sophia had taught him without words what truly mattered. When he finished, the silence was followed by discreet but sincere applause. And in that moment, Alexander realized he had signed the most valuable contract of his life. As evening painted the mansion gardens in shades of amber, Alexander Reed found Grace Miller in the inner courtyard, folding towels and arranging tables. She seemed oblivious to the stairs, focused on every detail with quiet dedication. He approached slowly, feeling the weight of the words he needed to say. For a moment, he hesitated, as if pride tried to pull him back by the collar. But the memory of Sophia calling for Grace gave him courage. "I wanted to speak with you alone," he said, his voice lower than usual. Grace lifted her eyes, surprised, but continued her task. "Last night you showed me more than courage. You showed me what it means to have heart." She remained silent, waiting. Alexander drew a breath, his eyes misting. "And I failed at both." The confession hung in the air like a weight finally released. Grace straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gaze was steady, without resentment, only dignity. "I didn't need your words to do what was right," she replied. "I just couldn't let Sophia suffer." The simple words cut deeper than any accusation. He realized his arrogance looked absurd beside her simplicity. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, almost pleading. Grace shook her head softly, as if refusing any reward. You don't need to thank me. You only need to look at her with the same care you expected from me." The phrase sounded like both sentence and counsel. Alexander felt the knot in his throat tighten, but also a strange relief. It was as though he had found the first step on a forgotten path. Sophia came running, breaking the moment with light laughter. She held a crayon drawing in her hands. She showed it to her father and Grace, 3 figures holding hands by the glowing pool. "It's us," she said with a smile. "No one will get lost here again." Grace smiled, touched, stroking the child's hair. Alexander held the paper, his eyes brimming at the sight of his family drawn that way. He realized that to Sophia, Grace was already part of their inner circle. And that truth didn't sting as before, it brought unexpected comfort. For a moment, he let himself imagine a life less hardened. A life where he could share responsibilities without feeling he lost power. The sun set slowly, bathing the garden in golden tones that enveloped the 3 of them. And in that instant, Alexander knew he could never go back to being the man he once was. The next morning, Sophia woke earlier than usual, full of energy. She ran through the mansion's halls calling for Grace Miller, as if she were family. Alexander Reed heard his daughter's voice echo and felt his chest tighten. The pride that had always kept him distant now seemed like a useless burden. He found them both in the garden, seated on the dew-covered grass. Grace was helping Sophia weave colorful flowers into a little crown. The girl laughed, content, while her stuffed bunny lay nearby. Alexander approached slowly, without his usual armor of authority. Grace greeted him with a discreet nod, respectful as ever. But Sophia ran to grab his hand, pulling him closer to them. "Daddy, look! Grace taught me to make a gift for you." He knelt down, receiving the flower crown as if it were a trophy. Holding the fragile gift, Alexander felt his eyes well up. It was just a child's gesture, yet it carried an immense meaning. For years, he had sought recognition in applause, contracts, and figures. Now, his daughter handed him something simple and pure, worth more than any fortune. Grace watched the scene in silence, a faint smile on her lips. There was tenderness in her gaze, but also a respectful distance. Alexander noticed it and longed to come closer, not only as her employer. He wanted her to know he no longer saw her as just a maid. "You changed everything yesterday," he murmured, gripping the crown tightly. Grace lowered her eyes, not seeking recognition. For her, the only thing that mattered was seeing Sophia safe and smiling. And that humility only deepened the admiration he felt. That morning, Alexander canceled his business appointments to stay home. He spent hours with his daughter, helping her color and listening to stories told by Grace. At first, it felt strange, so far from the fast-paced rhythm he was used to. But slowly, he discovered a new joy in that simple routine. He noticed details he had long ignored. The way Sophia laughed, Grace's patience, the beauty of silence. It was as if he were learning to live again, rediscovering forgotten senses. The mansion staff observed discreetly, surprised by their employer's change. The man who once knew only how to give orders now knelt on the grass with his child. Grace, meanwhile, remained steady, but she too saw the transformation unfolding before her eyes. Alexander knew he still had much to learn, but he had taken the first step. And that step would lead him down a path he had never imagined. A path where humility and love meant more than any figure. That evening, Alexander Reed once again gathered guests in his mansion. This time, not to talk about business, but for something more personal. The bright hall filled with curious looks, all expecting another speech on wealth. Alexander stepped onto the small improvised stage, holding Sophia by the hand. The little girl smiled shyly, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. Grace Miller stood at the back, discreet, trying not to draw attention. Alexander drew a deep breath, scanning the attentive faces around him. "Yesterday, many of you were here when I failed as a man and as a father," he began. The silence was immediate, each word heavier than any figure. "I was unjust, arrogant, and disrespectful. And yet, when my daughter needed help most, it was not me who saved her." His eyes turned toward Grace, who widened hers in surprise at being mentioned. "It was her," he finished, his voice trembling yet firm. Every gaze shifted to the young maid. Grace felt her knees weaken but stood tall, breathing deeply. Alexander continued, "Today, I want you all to know that I owe this woman more than any fortune. She risked her life to save Sophia's. And from this moment on, she will never again be treated here as less than she deserves." A murmur ran through the hall, soon turning into warm applause. Grace's eyes filled with tears, though she held her composure, remaining professional. Sophia let go of her father's hand and ran to her, hugging her tightly. The gesture drew tears from employees and guests alike, touched by the scene. Alexander stepped down from the stage and walked toward them. He placed a hand on Grace's shoulder with genuine respect. "You changed my life, Grace. I will never forget this." Applause echoed through the hall, filling the air with emotion. Grace blushed, thanking in a low voice without boasting. "I only did what anyone would have done for her," she said. Alexander smiled, but he knew it wasn't true. Few would have shown such courage. Sophia held both their hands, linking them in a bond that felt unbreakable. The millionaire realized his daughter had already chosen Grace as part of her life, and surprisingly, he felt relieved to accept it. In that moment, he understood that respect and humanity were not weakness but strength. The hall came alive again, but the gathering now held a different meaning. It was no longer about wealth, but about recognition and gratitude. And Alexander finally felt he was taking the first step toward being remembered not as arrogant, but as human. A man transformed by a night that would never be forgotten. The mansion grew quiet after the last guests left, leaving only echoes of applause. Alexander Reed walked slowly through the corridors, carrying Sophia asleep in his arms. Her peaceful face was a living portrait of what he had almost lost. Laying her gently in bed, he covered her and placed the bunny beside her. He lingered for minutes, just watching, listening to her calm breathing. In his chest, the truth burned. No contract, no fortune could ever matter if he had lost her. He closed the door softly and walked to the hall, where Grace Miller was tidying trays. She moved quietly, as if the night had not yet ended. Alexander stopped before her, no pride left on his shoulders. "I have no words big enough," he said, his voice sincere. Grace looked up, surprised by his gentleness. "You don't need any," she replied. "Sophia is safe. That's what matters." Alexander stood silent for a few seconds, fighting back emotion. Then he breathed deeply and added, "But you need to know. You changed who I am." Grace did not reply immediately, but her eyes showed she understood. It was as if she recognized the transformation without demanding anything in return. Sophia appeared in the corridor, still drowsy, and ran to grab Grace's hand. Alexander watched and smiled, accepting what he once would have resisted. It was not a loss of authority, but a gain of humanity. In that moment, he saw that his daughter had chosen wisely, someone who loved without asking for anything, and that lesson would stay with him forever, far beyond that night. The millionaire once remembered for his arrogance would now be marked by his change. And Grace, once invisible, had become essential to that transformation. Fate, in its quiet irony, had given them all a second chance. On the veranda, Alexander gazed at the starry sky, finally feeling at peace. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but none shone brighter than Sophia's smile. For the first time in years, the future seemed more than business and contracts. It seemed like a road where love and humility walked side by side. Grace entered quietly, Sophia's hand in hers, both smiling like a family. And Alexander understood that this was the true legacy. Not wealth, but humanity. The memories of humiliation and near tragedy would always remain. Not as weakness, but as proof of the courage to change while there was still time. He closed his eyes for a moment, silently thanking life. He knew he could never be the same man again, because what mattered most had been saved. Not only his daughter, but his soul. And that night, he discovered that redemption is the greatest luxury a man can possess. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any new videos, and of course, leave your like. It really helps the channel keep bringing more emotional stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support.